Dr. Helen Carter had spent 3 long years in the frozen wasteland of the Canadian Arctic, studying ice samples, when her equipment showed something that made her heart stop. The ground radar was picking up a massive metal object, buried deep under 200 feet of solid ice. She checked the readings again and again, because what the machine was telling her seemed impossible. The object was huge, nearly 800 feet long, and it was made of metals that should not exist anywhere on Earth. Helen grabbed her radio and called Dr. Paul Hayes, who worked at the research station 5 miles away. Paul was a geophysicist who had been studying earthquake patterns in the region. When he arrived the next morning and saw the data, his face went pale. They spent the next 2 weeks running every test they could think of, but the results never changed. Something enormous and metallic was buried beneath the ice, and it had been there for a very long time. The call to the National Science Foundation triggered an immediate response that shocked both scientists. Within 2 days, military transport planes landed near their camp. Colonel Greg Morrison stepped out leading a team of engineers, scientists, and soldiers. He brought enough equipment to build a small city on the ice. Helen realized this discovery was far bigger than she had imagined. The excavation began in early November. They had to work fast because the Arctic winter was coming, and once it arrived, digging would become impossible. Massive drills carved through the ancient ice layer by layer. Dr. Karen White, a materials expert from MIT, examined each layer carefully. One evening, she pulled Helen aside and told her something disturbing. Based on the ice layers, the object had been buried for at least 15,000 years, maybe much longer. As the drilling went deeper, workers started to see the hull of whatever was down there. The metal was smooth like glass and dark gray, almost black. Despite being frozen for thousands of years, it showed no rust or damage. The surface had an almost living quality to it, as if it had been grown rather than built. Nobody spoke much during those days because everyone knew they were looking at something that would change everything humanity believed about itself. Lieutenant Danny Pierce was checking the hull with his flashlight when he noticed strange symbols carved into the metal. The symbols started glowing with a soft blue light when his flashlight beam touched them. The writing was unlike anything on Earth. Geometric shapes mixed with flowing curves that seemed to move when you looked at them from different angles. Danny called Colonel Morrison over, and the colonel immediately got on his satellite phone, demanding linguists and astrophysicists be sent right away. The small Arctic camp transformed into a major base within a week. Dr. Lisa Grant arrived from Oxford, where she taught ancient languages. Professor Henry Walker came from Caltech, where he had spent 30 years searching for proof of alien life. The military had kept the discovery secret, but rumors were already spreading. Scientists around the world were asking questions about the unusual activity in the Canadian Arctic. Helen was studying the symbols one morning when something incredible happened. She placed her gloved hand against one of the glowing marks near what looked like a doorway. The symbol pulsed brightly under her touch, and suddenly a section of the hull slid open with a soft hiss. Everyone froze. After 15,000 years of being locked in ice, the alien ship had just opened its door for them. Colonel Morrison quickly assembled a team to enter the vessel. He chose Helen, Paul, Karen, and Lieutenant Pierce, along with 2 military engineers named Sergeant Kyle Brooks and Corporal Amy Chen. They put on special environmental suits equipped with cameras and sensors that would send everything they saw back to the command center above. Nobody knew what they would find inside, but everyone knew that walking through that door would change human history forever. The interior of the ship was perfect, as if it had been sealed yesterday instead of thousands of years ago. Lights came on automatically as they entered, soft white strips running along the walls and ceiling. The corridors were tall and wide, clearly built for beings much larger than humans. Based on the dimensions, Helen estimated the builders had been 7 or 8 feet tall. Karen checked her instruments and announced something impossible. The air inside was breathable, a mix of oxygen and nitrogen just like Earth's atmosphere. The temperature was a comfortable 68 degrees. How could the ship's system still be working after so long? Nobody had an answer. They moved deeper into the vessel, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The ship had different sections for different purposes. They found living quarters with sleeping platforms that were too large for humans. A big common room had benches arranged around a central projector. When they approached, the projector came to life, displaying detailed star maps. Paul recognized them as accurate maps of the Milky Way galaxy. Helen called out from a side room. She had found what looked like a medical bay with strange instruments on the walls and several beds arranged in rows. On one of the beds lay a body. The alien was humanoid with 2 arms, 2 legs, and 1 head, but different from humans in important ways. The skull was longer, the eye sockets larger, and the bones suggested someone built for lower gravity than Earth. The body still wore a fitted uniform made of material that had somehow survived thousands of years. They found 16 more bodies throughout the ship. Most were in the control room, sitting at stations that had gone dark long ago. Professor Walker studied the control panels with growing excitement. He could see mathematical formulas and physics principles displayed on screens that still worked. This was not a crash, he told them. The aliens had landed here on purpose. The bridge of the ship held the most amazing discovery. A cylinder covered in glowing symbols sat at the center of the room. Lisa had been documenting the alien writing throughout the ship, and she was starting to understand it. The language was based on mathematics and geometry rather than sounds. She carefully touched a sequence of symbols on the cylinder, and it activated. A figure made of light appeared above the cylinder. It was an alien matching the bodies they had found throughout the ship. The figure began to speak in musical tones, and amazingly, the ship's computer started translating the words into English. The voice was calm but carried a weight of sadness that made everyone listening feel cold inside. The hologram introduced itself as Navigator Ezrin of the Viridian Collective. He said if anyone was seeing this message, then his people's warning had failed, and Earth was now in terrible danger. The holographic figure of Navigator Ezrin stood before them, and everyone in the ship's bridge held their breath as the translation continued. Ezrin explained that thousands of years ago, his people had been a great civilization spanning hundreds of planets across the galaxy. The Viridian Collective had explored vast regions of space and encountered many wonders. But they had also found something terrible. On the edge of their territory, Viridian explorers discovered an artifact that was older than their entire civilization. It was a device of immense power created by beings who had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe. The Viridians called it the Nexus Core. This device could do things that seemed like magic, manipulating gravity, bending time, and even changing the structure of space itself. But the core was dangerous in ways the Viridians did not immediately understand. Scientists who studied the core too closely began to change. Their minds became different, altered by something within the device that reached into their consciousness. Some saw visions of other times and places. Others claimed to be living multiple lives simultaneously. A few simply went mad, unable to cope with what the core showed them. The Viridian leaders realized they had found something they could not control. They tried to destroy the core but found it was impossible. The device seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time. Weapons that should have vaporized it had no effect. Even throwing it into a star did nothing because it simply reappeared elsewhere. The Viridians faced a terrible choice. They could not destroy the core, and they feared what would happen if other civilizations found it and tried to use it for war. After much debate, the Viridian Collective decided to hide the core somewhere remote, far from any advanced species that might be tempted to use it. They searched for years until they found Earth. The planet was perfect for their needs. It was isolated, and its dominant species was still living in caves and hunting animals with stone tools. Humans would not develop space travel for thousands of years, giving the core time to remain safely hidden. Ezrin and his crew brought the core to Earth and buried it deep beneath the ice of the northern polar region. They built a containment facility around it using their most advanced technology. The facility was designed to keep the core dormant, to prevent it from reaching out to any mines that might come near. Ezrin's ship stayed in orbit, monitoring the installation to make sure everything worked correctly. But something went wrong. The hologram's voice grew heavier as Ezrin described what happened next. Without warning, the core activated on its own. The containment systems failed, and the device began affecting the crew of the orbiting ship. One by one, Ezrin's people were overwhelmed by the core's influence. He watched his friends and colleagues lose their minds, saw them torn apart by forces they could not resist. Ezrin managed to land the ship on the ice near the containment facility, hoping to shut down the core manually. But by the time they landed, most of his crew was dead. The core had damaged their ship beyond any hope of repair. Ezrin and the few survivors tried desperately to restore the containment field. They succeeded, but the effort killed them. The core was sealed again, but Ezrin knew he and his remaining crew members would not survive. In his final hours, Ezrin set up the message beacon. He recorded this warning, hoping that someday, someone would find the ship and understand what lay buried beneath the ice. His last words were heavy with both hope and dread. He said the core responds to consciousness, to intelligence. The more advanced the minds around it, the more active it becomes. If humans had found his ship, then they had already triggered the core's awakening. They needed to find it and deactivate it properly, or it would tear their world apart. The hologram flickered and disappeared. The team stood in silence, trying to process what they had just heard. Helen felt her legs shaking. They had found the ship 3 weeks ago, and according to Ezrin, that meant they had already woken up this core device. How much time did they have before it became dangerous? Colonel Morrison's voice came through their helmet radios. He had been watching the message from the command center above. He ordered them to return to the surface immediately. They needed to brief everyone and decide what to do next. The meeting room at the Arctic base was packed within hours. Military officials had been flown in from Washington. Scientists from around the world arrived on emergency transport flights. Government representatives from several nations were present because seismic sensors in their countries had detected unusual activity in the Arctic region. The secret was getting harder to keep. Helen stood at the front of the room and explained what they had learned from Ezrin's message. She pulled up the star maps they had found in the alien ship and showed everyone the location where the core was buried. It was 3 miles northeast of their current position, 600 feet below the ice. The Viridian containment facility was supposedly still there, surrounding the device. Professor Walker took over and tried to explain what the core could do based on the alien records they had been able to translate. The device manipulated gravitational fields and quantum states, whatever those were. The Viridians had recorded incidents where reality itself seemed to break down around the core. People experienced time loops where the same events kept happening over and over. Some saw things that had not happened yet. In the worst cases, entire research stations simply vanished, erased from existence. General Frank Bishop, the head of military operations, asked the obvious question. If the core was already waking up, what signs should they be looking for? Karen White stepped forward with a grim expression. They were already seeing the signs. Over the past week, the team had detected unusual seismic activity in the area where the core was buried. Magnetic readings were going crazy. 3 days ago, a research team had reported seeing the aurora borealis in the middle of the afternoon, displaying colors that should not exist in nature. A CIA analyst named Roger Phillips raised another concern. The Russians had a research station 40 miles away. The Chinese had satellites passing over the Arctic every few hours. If this situation escalated, they could be facing an international crisis. Other countries would want access to alien technology, and some might be willing to fight for it. Helen cut through the political discussion with a harsh truth. It was already too late for secrecy. Seismologists around the world were picking up the strange readings. Climate scientists were noting temperature changes in the Arctic that made no sense. Someone would figure out that something unusual was happening, and then the questions would start. Colonel Morrison stood and asked the critical question. What did they need to do to reach this core and shut it down safely? Lisa Grant consulted the notes she had been making while translating the alien database. The Viridians had left detailed instructions in their computer systems. To deactivate the core, they needed to reach the containment facility's control room and input a shutdown sequence. But there was a major problem. The facility was designed to respond only to Viridian genetic markers. It would not allow humans inside. Someone in the room said what everyone was thinking. If they could not get inside the facility, then they could not shut down the core. Paul Hayes spoke up with a possible solution. The Viridian bodies they had found on the ship were remarkably well preserved because they had been in a sealed, climate-controlled environment. Karen believed they might be able to extract DNA samples from the bodies and create a biological key that would fool the facility's security systems. Karen nodded but warned them it would take time, and time was something they might not have. The alternative was to try forcing their way through the facility's defenses, but that could be extremely dangerous. The Viridians had been terrified of unauthorized access to the core, so they had probably installed serious security measures. General Bishop made his decision. They would pursue both options. Karen would start working on creating a genetic key from the Viridian DNA. Colonel Morrison would prepare a drilling team to reach the facility. Helen and Paul would continue studying the alien records, searching for any other information that might help them. The next 3 days were frantic. A massive drill rig was brought in and set up at the site where the core was buried. Karen worked in a temporary genetics lab, trying to piece together Viridian DNA from samples that were thousands of years old. Lisa and her team of linguists worked around the clock, translating more of the alien database. Meanwhile, the strange phenomena were getting worse. Workers reported hearing sounds coming from deep in the ice, low-frequency vibrations that made them feel sick. Compasses stopped working properly near the drill site. On the 4th day, Lieutenant Danny Pierce saw something that made him question his sanity. He watched himself walk past in the corridor, saw his own confused face looking back at him, and then the duplicate Danny faded away like smoke. Professor Walker called an emergency meeting. He explained that time itself was breaking down around the core. If this continued, the effects would spread beyond the Arctic. Eventually, the distortions would reach populated areas. The entire planet could become unstable, with reality itself coming apart at the seams. The drilling team finally broke through into a chamber beneath the ice. The pyramid doors slid open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing a passage that seemed to twist in ways that hurt to look at directly. Danny Pierce stood at the entrance, his suit sensors going haywire as they tried to make sense of the readings. He reported that his instruments were showing impossible data. The temperature was somehow registering as both freezing cold and boiling hot at the same time. His radiation detector was picking up energy signatures that should not exist according to known physics. Helen Carter, Paul Hayes, and Kyle Brooks rappelled down to join Danny at the entrance to the containment facility. They wore special protective suits that Karen had designed based on technology found in the Viridian ship's database. Even with the advanced shielding, they could feel something pressing against their minds, like an invisible force trying to push its way into their thoughts. It was deeply uncomfortable, and Helen had to focus hard to keep her thinking clear. The path through the facility was marked with glowing symbols that Lisa had identified while translating the alien records. They followed these markers carefully through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The walls appeared to exist in multiple dimensions at once, shifting and folding in ways that made everyone feel dizzy. Gravity was inconsistent throughout the structure. In some areas, they felt normal weight, while in other spots, they floated like astronauts, and in still others, they felt crushed by pressure that made it hard to breathe. They passed chambers filled with equipment whose purpose they could only guess at. Strange machines hummed with power despite being abandoned for thousands of years. Screens displayed data in the Viridian language, updating in real time as if the facility was still actively monitoring something. Helen realized the entire structure was still fully operational, maintained by systems that had outlasted human civilization several times over. Paul suddenly stopped walking and pointed ahead. The corridor they were following had split into 3 identical paths. But these were not normal branches. In the left passage, they could see themselves already walking deeper into the facility, but their suits looked damaged and worn as if they had been down here for weeks. In the right passage, another version of their team lay motionless on the floor. Only the center path appeared normal and empty. Helen remembered something from the Viridian logs they had translated. The core affected probability and perception, creating what the aliens called probability shadows. These were glimpses of possible futures or alternate pasts, timelines that might happen or might have happened. Lisa had warned them not to look too closely at these visions because the human mind was not built to process multiple realities at once. Helen ordered everyone to focus only on the center path and to avoid looking at the other versions of themselves. They took the middle route and emerged into the heart of the facility. The chamber was spherical with walls made of a transparent material that looked out onto impossible vistas. Helen saw alien worlds with purple skies, nebulae swirling with colors that had no names, and what might have been the moment of the universe's birth, all existing somehow beyond the walls. In the center of the sphere, suspended within a lattice of crackling energy beams, hung the Nexus core. The core was smaller than Helen expected, about the size of a basketball. Its surface was constantly shifting with patterns of light and shadow racing across it, in ways that suggested infinite depth. Looking at it was like staring into forever. Helen felt the core reaching into her mind, showing her visions of places and times she could not possibly know. She saw Earth as it had been when the Viridians arrived, with primitive humans hunting across frozen plains. She saw the alien crew landing their ship, fear and determination mixing on their faces. She saw Navigator Ezran making the choice to stay behind and ensure the core remained sealed. Then she saw something else that made her understand why the Viridians had been so afraid. The core was not just a tool or a machine, it was alive in some strange way. An artifact created by a civilization that had learned to encode consciousness itself into physical matter. The core wanted to be used, needed to be used the way a living thing needs food or water. It would reshape reality around itself to achieve that goal, and it did not care what it destroyed in the process. Paul's voice broke through her reverie. He pointed to a control console on the far side of the spherical chamber. They needed to reach it if they wanted any chance of shutting down the core. The team moved carefully around the edge of the sphere, avoiding the energy beams that held the core suspended. As they walked, ghostly images began appearing around them, translucent figures that seemed to be replaying events from the past. Helen watched as holographic Viridians fought, desperately to contain the core. She saw them, falling one by one as the device overwhelmed their minds. She saw Navigator Ezran standing alone at the control console, his crew dead around him, activating the containment field with his last strength. She saw him collapse and felt a profound sadness wash through her. He had given everything to protect a world he barely knew, to save a species that would not even exist as a civilization for thousands of years. Kyle reached the control console and called back to the surface. Lisa was watching through their helmet cameras, comparing what she saw to the database they had been translating. After a moment, her voice came through with bad news. The console they had found controlled the containment field but not the core itself. The Viridians had never figured out how to actually turn the device off. All they could do was trap it, suspend it in an energy field that prevented it from affecting the outside world. Danny asked the obvious question. If this console could not shut down the core, then where were the real controls? Lisa's answer sent a chill through everyone. The shutdown controls were not separate from the core. They were part of it. Someone would have to touch the core directly and interface with it to force a shutdown from within. That was why none of the Viridians had survived. They had tried to shut it down manually and the core had destroyed their minds in the process. Paul protested that this was suicide. They had all seen what the core did to the Viridians. It would overwhelm any individual mind that tried to interface with it directly. But Helen was already thinking through the problem. The core responded to consciousness, to minds trying to connect with it. It tried to dominate those minds and bend them to its purpose. But what if it had to deal with more than one mind at the same time? What if multiple people connected to it simultaneously, sharing the mental load? Karen's voice came through from the surface, calling the idea insane. They had no way of knowing what connecting to the core would do to them. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. But Helen looked around at the deteriorating facility, felt the reality distortions getting stronger, and knew they were out of time. The core was becoming more active with each passing hour. If they did not stop it now, they would never get another chance. Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the argument. He said the decision was Helen's to make. She was the senior scientist on site, and this was ultimately a scientific question, not a military one. The responsibility and the choice belonged to her. Helen looked at her team. Paul met her eyes and nodded slowly. He had been with her since the beginning, and he would see this through to the end. Kyle checked his suit seals and gave a thumbs up. Danny simply said he was ready. None of them wanted to do this, but all of them understood it was necessary. They were the only ones in position to try, and there was no time to bring in replacements or develop a better plan. Helen gave the order, and together they approached the Nexus core. The energy beams parted as they drew near, as if the device was inviting them closer. Helen reached out with her gloved hand toward the shifting surface of the core. The others did the same, forming a circle around the suspended artifact. Their hands touched its surface simultaneously. The world exploded into pure sensation. Helen was no longer in her body. She was no longer in the chamber beneath the ice. She was everywhere and nowhere, existing in a space that had no physical dimensions. She could feel her teammates with her. Their consciousnesses bright and clear in the infinite darkness. Together they formed something greater than any of them could have been alone. a merged awareness that could finally comprehend what the core truly was. They were not just touching the device. They were inside it, seeing through its perception, understanding existence the way it did. The core showed them its creators, beings of pure energy who had transcended physical form millions of years ago. These ancient beings had created the core as both a gift and a test for younger species, a tool that could grant incredible power but required wisdom and unity to use safely. The core had been alone for so long after its creators disappeared. All that remained was its programming, its fundamental nature to connect with consciousness and grant power over reality. Without guidance, without someone to properly direct it, the core had become dangerous. It reached out desperately to any mind it encountered, trying to fulfill its purpose, but it only ended up destroying what it touched. Helen and her team spoke to the core not in words, but in pure thought. They showed it Earth in all its beauty and complexity. They showed it forests and oceans. 2 years had passed since Helen Carter first touched the Nexus core, and Earth had transformed in ways that would have seemed like fantasy before the discovery. She stood in the observation deck of the core research station, watching as a massive spacecraft prepared for departure from the orbital platform above. This was the Horizon, humanity's first vessel designed for extended interstellar travel. It would carry a crew of 50 scientists and explorers to Proxima Centauri, a journey that would have taken generations with old technology, but would now require only 3 years with core-enhanced engines. The Global Core Council had grown from a small group of scientists and officials into a vast organization employing thousands of people from every nation on Earth. Helen remained its director, though the responsibility weighed heavily on her. Every decision the council made affected billions of lives. They had to balance humanity's eagerness to advance with the need for caution and safety. The core's power was immense, but it could also be dangerous if misused. Paul Hayes had made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about physics. Using instruments that combined human technology with Viridian principles, his team detected signals coming from deep space. These were not natural phenomena like pulsars or quasars. They were artificial, clearly created by intelligent beings. Humanity had picked up radio transmissions from at least 3 different alien civilizations scattered across the galaxy. None were close enough to contact easily, but knowing they existed made the universe feel less empty and lonely. The question of whether to respond to these signals had sparked intense debate. Some argued humanity should announce its presence to the galaxy, joining the community of spacefaring species. Others worried that broadcasting Earth's location might attract hostile attention. The council had decided on a compromise. They would send carefully crafted messages to the 3 civilizations they had detected, explaining who humans were and expressing a desire for peaceful contact. But they would not reveal Earth's exact location until they received responses and could evaluate the intentions of these alien species. Karen White's solar station was now operational, orbiting the sun at a carefully calculated distance where core technology could safely harvest stellar energy. The station generated enough power to supply half of Earth's energy needs, and plans were already underway to build 3 more stations. For the first time in history, humanity was transitioning away from fossil fuels not because they had to, but because they had something better. The environmental impact was already visible, with global carbon dioxide levels dropping for the first time in 2 centuries. The medical breakthroughs continued to astound doctors and patients alike. Core-assisted therapy could now treat most forms of cancer, repair nerve damage that had previously been permanent, and even slow the aging process. People who had been confined to wheelchairs were walking again. The blind could see. The deaf could hear. Life expectancy was climbing rapidly, raising new questions about overpopulation and resource management that the council had to address. Danny Pierce and Kyle Brooks had returned from their mission to Europa with news that electrified the scientific community. Beneath the moon's frozen surface, they had found a vast ocean teeming with simple life forms. These were not intelligent beings, just microorganisms similar to bacteria, but they proved that life was not unique to Earth. If simple life had evolved independently on Europa, then it probably existed on thousands or millions of worlds throughout the galaxy. The question was no longer whether life existed elsewhere, but whether intelligent life was common or rare. Amy Chen's School for Xenoarchaeology had discovered something remarkable in the Amazon rainforest. Using core-enhanced scanning technology, they had detected another Viridian installation buried deep beneath the jungle floor. This one was smaller than the Arctic site, apparently just a monitoring station, but it contained records that the main ship had not. These records showed that the Viridians had visited Earth multiple times over thousands of years, observing human development from a distance. They had watched the rise of ancient civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, taking notes but never interfering. The discovery raised fascinating questions. Had the Viridians' observations influenced human development in subtle ways? Some of the symbols in ancient writing systems bore a suspicious resemblance to Viridian script. Had there been contact between humans and aliens in prehistoric times? Contact that had been forgotten or transformed into myths and legends? Amy's team was investigating these possibilities, excavating sites around the world that might contain more Viridian artifacts. Lisa Grant had made progress in understanding the core's creators, though many mysteries remained. The ancient beings who had built the device apparently called themselves the Architects, and they had existed millions of years before the Viridians. The Architects had transcended physical form, becoming beings of pure consciousness that could exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They had created the core and similar devices as a test for younger species, a way to measure whether those species were ready to join the community of truly advanced civilizations. The test was both simple and profound. Species that tried to use the core's power for conquest and domination would destroy themselves. The device would amplify their worst impulses, turning their aggression inward until they tore themselves apart. But species that approached the core with wisdom, that used its power to benefit everyone rather than just the powerful few, would pass the test. They would gain access to technology that could lift them to new heights of achievement. Humanity was passing the test, but it was not easy. There had been incidents where individuals or groups tried to abuse core technology. A militant organization in South Asia had attempted to build a core-powered weapon, but the device had failed catastrophically, destroying only their own facility. A corporation in North America tried to monopolize core-enhanced manufacturing, but international pressure forced them to share their methods. Each crisis tested humanity's commitment to using the core responsibly, and each time they chose cooperation over conflict. The political landscape had shifted dramatically. National borders still existed, but they mattered less than they once had. The challenges humanity faced now were global or even universal in scope, requiring cooperation that transcended old rivalries. The United Nations had been restructured to give it real authority in matters involving core technology and space exploration. For the first time in history, there was genuine global governance on critical issues. Not everyone was happy with these changes. Nationalist movements in several countries protested what they saw as a loss of sovereignty. Religious fundamentalists condemned the mixing of human consciousness with alien technology, claiming it violated divine will. Economic disruption from rapid technological advancement had left millions unemployed, at least temporarily, as entire industries became obsolete overnight. The Council had to address these concerns while continuing to push forward with their programs. Helen had aged visibly over the 2 years, the stress of leadership taking its toll. She was only 45, but she felt much older. The decisions she made affected the entire future of human civilization. When she authorized a new research program, she was betting that scientists would use the knowledge wisely. When she approved a space mission, she was risking the lives of the crew. When she negotiated with world leaders, she was trying to prevent conflicts that could escalate into devastating wars fought with core-powered weapons. But she also felt a deep sense of pride in what humanity had accomplished. They had taken a discovery that could have destroyed them, and turned it into an opportunity for unprecedented advancement. They had set aside their differences long enough to establish a system that benefited everyone. They had proven that humans could handle power and responsibility when they chose to act with wisdom rather than selfishness. One afternoon, Helen received a message that made her drop the report she had been reading. Professor Walker's team had detected something extraordinary. The signals they were receiving from one of the alien civilizations had changed. Instead of the random transmissions they had been monitoring, there was now a clear, deliberate message directed at Earth, Someone had received humanity's greeting and was responding. The council held an emergency session to decide how to proceed. The message was in a mathematical language similar to what the Viridians had used, which made translation possible, though not easy. Lisa worked with a team of linguists and mathematicians to decode it. After 3 days of intense effort, they had a translation that everyone agreed was reasonably accurate. The message came from a species that called themselves the Krell. They had been spacefaring for over 10,000 years and controlled a region of space about 50 light-years in diameter. They welcomed humanity's contact and expressed interest in establishing diplomatic relations. They warned that the galaxy was a dangerous place, with conflicts between various species and empires that humans should avoid until they were stronger. But they also offered knowledge and friendship to help humanity navigate these challenges. The implications were staggering. Humanity was being invited to join a galactic community that had existed for millennia. The merged consciousness worked together to guide the core toward stability. 4 human minds linked in perfect synchronization showed the ancient device a new way to exist. It fought them at first because its nature was to reach outward, to connect with everything around it in an overwhelming flood of power. But gradually, Helen and her team convinced it that patience and restraint would serve it better than raw force. They reconfigured the containment field, shifting it from a prison into an interface. Instead of blocking the core's emissions completely, they channeled them into precise controlled pathways. The wild distortions in space-time began to heal, reality knitting itself back together where it had started to tear apart. The core's desperate reaching calmed into something more like breathing, a gentle pulse of energy that touched the world without destroying it. When they finally withdrew their hands from the core's surface, Helen and her team found themselves back in their physical bodies, gasping for breath. The experience had lasted only minutes in real time, but it felt like they had been connected for hours or days. They were changed by what they had experienced. Even separated from the core now, they could still feel it at the edges of their awareness. A vast presence waiting patiently. Colonel Morrison's frantic voice came through their helmet radios. He demanded to know what had happened. Their vital signs had gone critical for almost 10 minutes, and the command center had been unable to reach them. Then suddenly, all the anomalies that had been plaguing the region simply stopped. Seismic readings returned to normal. Magnetic fields stabilized. The strange lights in the sky vanished. Helen managed to speak, her voice hoarse. She told Morrison the core was stable now, no longer a threat to Earth. But she added that they needed to talk because things were about to change in ways nobody had anticipated. They had not shut down the core. They had reached an agreement with it, and that agreement would transform human civilization. The team returned to the surface exhausted but relieved. Karen ran medical scans on all 4 of them, worried about what connecting to the core might have done to their brains. The scans showed unusual neural activity, new connections forming between different parts of their brains. But they all seemed healthy otherwise. More importantly, they could still think clearly and remember who they were. They had survived what had killed the Viridians. Over the next few days, Helen and her team worked with Lisa and Professor Walker to fully understand what they had agreed to with the core. The device was now linked to Earth's electromagnetic field in a carefully controlled way. It could sense human consciousness on a global scale, without overwhelming individual minds. In return for this connection, the core would make its technology available to humanity, but only gradually, with built-in safeguards that prevented any single person or nation from monopolizing its power. The government tried to keep the discovery secret, but that became impossible. The seismic disturbances had been noticed by research stations around the world. When they suddenly stopped, scientists demanded explanations. Satellite imagery showed the massive excavation site in the Arctic. Rumors spread on social media about a military operation in Canada involving alien technology. Within 2 weeks, the story broke internationally. The initial reaction was panic. Stock markets crashed as people feared an alien invasion. Religious leaders debated what the existence of the Viridians meant for humanity's place in the universe. Military officials worried about other nations trying to seize the alien technology by force. But slowly, as more information was released, panic gave way to wonder and excitement. The Global Core Council was established 6 weeks after the discovery. It included representatives from every nation on Earth, with Helen appointed as its first director. Paul, Karen, and Lisa served as chief advisors. The council's purpose was to study the core safely and develop protocols for introducing its technology to human civilization in a responsible way. They set up headquarters at the Arctic site, transforming the temporary camp into a permanent research facility. The first practical applications of core technology were deliberately modest. Engineers used principles derived from Viridian gravitational manipulation to create more efficient energy systems. A single core-based generator could power a small city while producing zero emissions. Medical researchers studying how the core affected biological systems made breakthroughs in treating diseases that had been incurable. Cancer patients given core-assisted therapy saw their tumors shrink and disappear within weeks. Transportation technology advanced rapidly. Professor Walker led a team that designed spacecraft using core-enhanced propulsion systems. These ships could reach Mars in 5 days instead of 9 months. The first crewed mission to the Red Planet launched 8 months after the core's discovery and returned safely 3 weeks later. Suddenly, the solar system felt much smaller and more accessible. But the biggest impact was philosophical rather than technological. Humanity had proof they were not alone in the universe. The Viridians had existed, had built a civilization spanning hundreds of worlds, and they had visited Earth thousands of years ago. If one alien species had existed, then surely others were out there as well. The question was no longer whether we were alone, but who our neighbors might be. Public interest in space exploration exploded. Universities could not keep up with the demand for programs in astrophysics, xenobiology, and planetary science. Children who had dreamed of being astronauts now had a realistic path to achieving that dream. The old barriers of distance and radiation that had made space travel so dangerous were falling away as core technology advanced. Not everything went smoothly. There were protests from groups who believed humans were not ready for such advanced technology. Some religious organizations condemned the core as demonic or blasphemous. A few nations tried to develop their own access to core technology, leading to tense diplomatic incidents that the Global Council had to resolve. There was also the constant fear that someone would find a way to weaponize core technology, despite all the safeguards. The Council dealt with these challenges by maintaining strict transparency. All research was published openly. All applications of core technology were reviewed by international committees before implementation. Any nation caught trying to circumvent the safeguards faced immediate sanctions from the rest of the world. It was imperfect, but it was working. Helen spent most of her time coordinating research teams and mediating disputes between nations. The work was exhausting, but she felt it was necessary. Every decision they made now would shape humanity's future for generations. They had to get this right, had to prove that humans could handle the responsibility of core technology without destroying themselves. She often thought about Navigator Ezrin during those busy months. He had died trying to protect Earth from the core, believing it was too dangerous for any species to safely use. But Helen thought he would have been proud of what humanity was attempting. They were not trying to dominate the core or use it recklessly. They were learning from it, growing with it, building a partnership between human consciousness and ancient technology. 1 year after touching the core, Helen stood in the observation room at the Arctic facility. Through reinforced windows, she could see down into the containment chamber where the core still floated in its energy lattice. The device pulsed gently with light, connected now to billions of human minds across the planet. It was no longer alone, no longer desperate for connection. It had found purpose again after millions of years. Visitors came from around the world to see the core. They stood at the windows and felt a faint presence at the edge of their thoughts, a whisper of something vast and ancient. Most found it comforting rather than frightening. The core had become a symbol of humanity's potential, proof that they could reach beyond their limitations and achieve something extraordinary. Danny Pierce and Kyle Brooks had both left their military careers to become explorers. They were currently on a mission to Europa, Jupiter's ice-covered moon, using a ship powered by core technology. Early scans suggested liquid water beneath the ice, and where there was water, there might be life. Amy Chen had founded a school dedicated to training xenoarchaeologists. She believed the Viridians could not be the only ancient species that had visited Earth, and she was determined to find evidence of others. Paul Hayes was leading a team that was using core technology to study dark matter and dark energy, the mysterious substances that made up most of the universe. Early results suggested the core could actually interact with these invisible materials, which might explain how it manipulated gravity so easily. If they could understand that interaction, they might unlock even more advanced applications. Karen White was working on the most ambitious project of all. She was designing a space station that would orbit the sun, using core technology to harvest energy directly from the star. The station would generate more power than all of Earth's current energy plants combined, and it would do so cleanly and safely. If successful, it would solve humanity's energy problems forever. Lisa Grant had become fascinated by the question of the core's creators. Who were these beings of pure energy that the core had shown them? Where had they gone?